So I'm done with the thank yous. My name is Maria Caldera, and I am a faculty in Women's Studies and American Studies, and inside the Latino Studies program. So the Latino Studies program is one of the sub-programs inside of the Department of American Culture. I am delighted to bring these wonderful scholars and artists together here today, and critics. It's kind of a first for our program, and I'm really, really thrilled that we have a critical mass of people in Latino arts and culture that we can reach out to across campus. This is really an amazing moment for us as a program and for the University of Michigan more generally. So I'm delighted that we can sort of be the avenue to introduce these amazing scholars, artists, critics to the broader community here through the Latino Studies program. I am going to introduce folks. I don't know if it's in the order that they're going to be presenting, but I do know that Jonathan Ovalle is going to go first, so I'm going to introduce him first. Jonathan Ovalle is an assistant professor of music and a co-coordinator of the percussion program at the University of Michigan. There, he serves as co-director of the university's famed percussion ensemble, director of the Latin Jazz Ensemble, director of Impulse Summer Percussion Institute, and also he serves as a faculty associate here in the Latino Studies program. Known for the remarkable versatility and percussive diversity of his work, he has made a career combining the worlds of symphonic, solo, chamber, jazz, pop, marching, and world percussion, playing into an aggressive mix with very few musical boundaries. We will also have Ashley Lucas, who's right here, who's an associate professor of theater and dance in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. She is the new director of the Prison Creative Arts Project, a project of long-standing here at the University of Michigan, and you guys are probably going to do a show in April, is that right?
March 25th to April 9th.
March 25th to April 9th. It's a fabulous show. The PCAP annual show is a work of prison arts, and it's really incredible. Professor Lucas is also the author of an ethnographic play about the families of prisoners entitled Doing Time Through the Visiting Glass, which she has performed as a one-woman show throughout the U.S. and in Ireland and Canada. She's published widely on the topic of prison theater and is the co-editor of a volume entitled Razor Wire Women, Prisoners, Activists, Scholars, and Artists, which has a companion blog by the same title. Please take a look at it. It's a fabulous blog, very interesting. I've had the pleasure of perusing it myself. Anita González is a professor of theater and drama at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And when did you join us, Anita, here?
I just joined in the fall.
She just joined in the fall. She's a newbie. Oh my goodness. So we're really excited to have these two fabulous artists and scholars over at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. I mean, it's really, really important. Anyway, no segues. Anita González's research and publication interests are in the fields of intercultural performance and ethnic studies, particularly the way in which performance reveals histories and identities in the Americas and in transnational contexts. She's published widely in this area and is also a director who has staged more than 52 productions during the course of her career. She views theatrical practice as a laboratory for artists and audiences to explore new ways of interacting and considering world issues at a personal level. And last but not least, we have Nilo Couret. Is that a proper pronunciation?
Yeah.
Okay. He's an assistant, also new.
That's right.
In the fall?
That's right.
Wow, okay. He's an assistant professor of Spanish and Romance Languages and Spanish in the Romance Languages and Literatures Department. His research focuses on comparative global film histories and transnational theories of film and media, analyzing cinema, new media, and popular culture from a trans-hemispheric perspective. Couret's research focuses on Latin American cinema and popular culture, as well as post-independence cinemas of Asia and Africa. And he's particularly interested in understanding how different forms of media respond to and shape counterpublics off-screen. So let's welcome them. I guess we'll have time for Q&A after.
All right, do you want to stand? Do you want to speak from here?
Whatever you feel comfortable doing.
I'll sit.
Okay.
So, it has to do this panel. I was thinking about what to speak on, and I think the intent here was to speak on sort of Dr. King's vision and how that manifests itself in our own respective disciplines. So for me as a musician, and particularly coaching the Latin Jazz Ensemble, that to me is very representative of what Dr. King's vision was. So I wanted to talk first about, just in a more broad-based perspective, the impact of his vision in terms of unity and equality and all the things that he stood for, and how that plays out in what I do in the Latin Jazz Ensemble. Latin jazz, if you've heard that term before, salsa, these are all kind of words that tend to get thrown around a little bit, so we'll just sort of clarify a little bit. In the ensemble that I teach, the Latin Jazz Ensemble, it's primarily focused on music that is Afro-Cuban based, that has a folkloric origin, but has been married with American jazz, and that's the term Latin jazz. There's a lot of subgenres, just as in, rock and roll, we can have indie rock and many other things. So in Latin jazz, there's music that has Afro-Cuban origin, there's music that has Peruvian origin, and there's even flamenco jazz. Lots of great things happening, really beautiful stuff. What's significant about this music for me is, certainly as a percussionist, it's incredibly vibrant, and it's what I think of as the greatest music in the world, because it is that perfect marriage of this unbelievable rhythmic impetus that's provided by, oftentimes in this case, Cuban music, with this really deep and complex melodic and harmonic language of jazz. So you have kind of the best of those both worlds, best of both of those worlds. So there's a word that often gets thrown out sometimes in a negative way, and that's fusion jazz. And when people speak of fusion jazz, it's sort of a less than encouraging tone. It's referring to a music period in the 70s where a lot of bebop musicians from the 60s were feeling a little bit contained by where the music was going. So musicians like Miles Davis, Billy Cobham, Jean-Luc Ponty, those guys, started to branch out and use electronic instruments. And for a lot of jazz purists, this was left a very bad taste in their mouth. And so a lot of times when you speak of fusion jazz nowadays, it has a little bit of a dirty connotation to it, and a little bit unjust so, I think, because I think it's really great music and is part of the history of that music from bebop to today. That word fusion, though, really describes what this music is of Latin jazz, and even though the word that we associate with that period in the 70s, that mixing of styles was happening long before that. It really started in the 1940s with musicians like Dizzy Gillespie, and him inviting the Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo to play with him in his band. And right there really was the birth of cubop in this music. And this is going back long before Miles Davis was, plugging in his trumpet. So, from my perspective, that first conversation between these two worlds of Cuban music, Cuban rhythms, folkloric, and jazz was happening a long time ago, and is really the best example, in my mind, of what I do in terms of realizing Dr. King's vision of unity and coming together. All of these musics that we're speaking of, jazz, even popular music of the day today, all has African origins. So if we were to make a tree of Latin jazz, straight ahead jazz, even popular music like Justin Bieber, whatever you're into, it all can be traced back to the same root. It all goes back to early black music and the blues and the church, and that all comes from Africa. So all this music, this diversity, has a common origin. In my work with my students, one of the things that's really important, and one of the things that I really gained in performance of this music, was a recognition of responsibility and a recognition of role in the ensemble. I think one of the mantras of Dr. King's vision in his effort to bring a diversity of cultures and people together was there was a lack of understanding, there was a lack of communication. There were assumptions being made on both sides about what black culture and white culture should be and shouldn't be, and he recognized that as a dividing point, and in his work was really looking for ways to understand another in a way to come together in unity. And so one of the things I found in this music as a performer that I really try to work hard when I'm teaching it is this idea that it's generally passed down by an oral tradition. So, this is music that only in the last 20 or 30 years, even jazz, was thought of as an academic discipline. This is music that was handed down from player to player, and you learned it in a club, or you learned it from a guru. And so what we're doing at school is I'm trying to still recreate that. So everything that we're doing in this class, aside from reading the charts that we're going to play in the concert in terms of the concepts, is all tried to be passed down through an oral tradition. So what I found is significant in my experience in playing this music is different from playing percussion in an orchestra or a concert band, where the responsibility of your role really involves a number of things. In an Afro-Cuban ensemble, my part might be playing a cowbell on a couple of counts, and that's my part, and that's what I'm going to play for the next half an hour. And there's something really incredibly joyous about that, particularly when the rest of the ensemble is responding and there's also listeners responding or dancers responding. So one of the things that's important, going back to this message of understanding, is it would be easy for me in that class, as an example, to just hand out a bunch of music and expect the students to play the parts that are on the page based on their existing knowledge of jazz and or music. What we try to do is we try to help every student in the class understand everybody else's part. So if you're a trumpet player in the class, let's say, you're going to spend some time in clave. You're going to spend some time understanding what the bass player is doing. And from a technical perspective, in terms of the music being really great, I found that to be really an important part of really playing that music well, is an understanding of all of the component parts. And I don't know that for me it's possible to really play that music at a really high level and experience it the way that it should be motivated without that understanding. So, again, in line with Dr. King's vision, this idea of a deeper understanding of the component parts of everybody's differences, and that kind of an ensemble. Who's familiar with some of that music? Who listens to salsa, Latin, jazz? All right, more people need to raise your hand. In that kind of music, what's significant about it is, as I mentioned, each of the players in the ensemble plays a very tiny role in the greater cog, the greater wheel, as it were. So the percussionists all have supporting roles. The piano player has a supporting role, but together is where the magic happens. So I find that when I'm teaching this class and everybody really understands how all of the component parts work, it's a much deeper level of performance. One thing I was going to also say is, in Dr. King's vision, I think his idea that unity is an important aspect of what he was trying to state and promote. In Latin jazz ensemble, this is another concept that we're working towards. For those of you that aren't familiar with the music, there's a rhythm called clave, right? Do people know about this, right? Okay, so if you don't know about it, let's learn it really quickly. Okay, so there's many different forms of clave, but clave is central to this music, and there's a famous saying that clave is the key, and that's really what it comes down to. It's the heartbeat. So, who in here is not a musician? Okay, so we're going to do this. Here we go. Ready? All right. So you've all heard this rhythm before. Ready? I'm going to clap it, and you're going to clap it with me. Right? Good. All right. So you did an amazing job. You're all hired. You're hired. So that's one form of clave. So one of the things that we try to do in Latin jazz is try to make sure that everybody understands the concept of clave and how all of the component parts fit together. In that pattern you just played, there's sort of a special note on one of those beats. It's called the bombo note, right? And it's the middle of the first bar. So all of the parts in the ensemble. So if I'm a piano player, I have a supporting role. If I'm the bass player, I have a supporting role. If I'm one of the percussionists, I have a supporting role. Everybody's playing parts that interlace together. And part of what makes the music have a lot of forward momentum is a lot of those parts are sort of momenting forward in their rhythm. They're syncopated. But everybody in the whole ensemble comes together on that beat, the bongo, right? So again, thinking about Dr. King's vision, if we want to make a metaphor here, is the diversity of our interests and our skin color. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all have the same heartbeat. We're all joined at that common place, right? So in this ensemble, sort of as a manifestation of that same thing, really understanding how to listen and how to come together in that place is really where the magic happens. So the last thing I want to say real quick is, this music, I think what's significant about it now is back 40, 50, 60 more years ago, when the idea of marrying folkloric Afro-Cuban or folkloric Brazilian music with jazz seemed a bit as a novelty. It was a bit on the fringe. And those musicians who engaged in that weren't necessarily thought of as mainstream jazz musicians. Nowadays, this music has become so integrated into mainstream jazz and what we do that as teachers of this music, it's really important that every student that I have has some working knowledge of what this music is and the significance of it. It's rare nowadays that I encounter musicians and other working professionals that I deal with on a regular basis that don't have some functional knowledge of this music. So the expectation is that you will come out of school with this understanding. So it's a great responsibility of those of us as teachers of the music and teachers of the tradition, for me, to make sure that not only are we learning about the rhythms and the parts, but we're learning about the history, we're learning about the significance, learning about the origins. All of my students that I have in this ensemble are coming from a diversity of interests. Some are percussionists, some play wind instruments, some are pianists, some are older, some are younger. And it's a great place for us to work together. This music, for me, is incredibly special and motivating, and I want to make sure that the people that are interested in carrying the torch really form a deep love and understanding that comes back to, again, this vision of Dr. King's, of really, the best way I can say this is about understanding. It's about understanding. It's about understanding each smaller part of the component whole, and that togetherness is ultimately what makes for more forward momentum. So I think in Dr. King's vision, one of the things very important to him was to recognize that our diversity as people, as cultures, regardless of our interests and religious orientation and skin color, that the power of our abilities as people, as human beings working together is strengthened by our diversity rather than weakened. And in the case of my respective discipline, Latin jazz, that to me is one of the greatest examples of that, is this unbelievable fortitude of rhythmic fire, as it were, combined with what has become an incredible lexicon of melodic and harmonic ideas that really, in my mind, without one or the other is not the same. So, thank you for allowing me to share.
All right, I'm a theater person, so I believe in standing up and taking the stage. Plus, I have a few images to share. My name is Ashley Lucas, as Monica was saying earlier, and I'm so grateful for the chance to be here as part of this Latino Studies panel, in large part because my work has primarily been in Latino Studies until I got this job in Michigan, where my focus has largely shifted to work happening in and around prisons. So today I want to draw some connections between my work in Latino theater and arts work that's happening right here in Michigan prisons. So if my PowerPoint would open.
It will, it's slow.
Okay, woohoo! All right, and I want, not a new slide, I want to play my
Just
slide.
slow down, get some slow.
Okay. All right, while this is, what did I do?
I have flying edges too, so.
Okay. Now see, here's the other thing. I am terrified of technology. Why is this? This is very strange. Oh no, wrong slide. Okay, yay! Also, as a theater person, I don't like to be upstaged by anything, including my own PowerPoint presentation. So I'm a little flustered, but there's some artwork that I wanted to show you today that is too good to be missed. But before we get there, I started off doing work in Latino theater because I'm a Chicana who was raised on the U.S.-Mexican border in El Paso, Texas. And growing up, I did theater. That was what I fell in love with. I really wanted to play basketball, but it turned out I was too short and no good. So the only other extracurricular activity in my middle school was theater. And that's how I ended up becoming a theater person. I realized I talked a whole lot better than I played basketball. And I realized that theater could, like all art forms, but theater is the one that I happen to be passionate about, we can express our lives and our culture and even social struggles to other groups of people who might not understand where we're coming from through this artistic medium. So a lot of the work that I have done and thought about and been a part of has to do with social protest work. And the roots of Chicana and Chicano theater right here in the United States really are about political struggle. So Luis Valdez, who was a farm worker growing up in California, and he came from a long line of farm workers, ended up going off to college in San Francisco as a young man and returned to his family of farm workers with a college education in theater after having done political theater with folks in the Bay Area. And he walked up to a man named Cesar Chavez and said, I realize you're trying to get this union thing off the ground, and I think what you really need is a theater company. And Cesar Chavez said, okay, well, maybe what we need is a theater company. And so Luis Valdez walked into a room full of farm workers and started handing out scripts and said, we're going to do a play. We're going to start doing these skits. We're going to perform. We're going to get people to join the union. And very quickly, he realized that his scripts were useless because the people in the room didn't read and write. So he had to throw those out the window and start doing improvised work, which is the foundation of the program that I now run here at the University of Michigan called the Prison Creative Arts Project. So there are a lot of folks all across the state of Michigan now engaged in theater practice because this fabulous man named Buzz Alexander, who's been a professor here at the University of Michigan for at least 3 decades, I think. He's an institution in himself here, but he founded PCAP, the Prison Creative Arts Project, in 1990 here at the U of M. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. The connections between Latino theater and prison theater have not always been explicit, but of course we know that Black and brown people in the United States are overrepresented in our prisons nationwide. So it makes sense that if Latino theater is about social protest and work that's happening in the arts and prisons is also about social protest, but the overlaps would be significant. So I got involved in Latino theater, as I said, growing up, but when I went off to graduate school and started studying social protest theater, I realized that I was becoming more and more interested in prisons. Part of this is because of my family history. My father went to prison when I was 15, and he's still incarcerated in Texas. Gracias a Dios, he's coming home in May. So after 20 years, we are finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But I realized that people in prisons are some of the most artistically deprived people, people who are cut off from the arts world in the outside prisons. We call it free world in prison terminology, but I think it's highly questionable to think about the world that we live in as being entirely free. But free world people can turn on the TV, can look at things on your computer, can go to an art gallery, and we have far greater access to books and other kinds of media that convey art to us than people in prisons do. So the work that I wanted to start doing, like the farm workers with Cesar Chavez and Luis Valdez, they went out into the fields to where the farm workers were and presented their theater as a way of getting people to join the United Farm Workers, to join the union and join the strike, be a part of the culture and the movement that they were engaged in. So I came to Michigan to start studying this thing called the Prison Creative Arts Project. In 2008, 2009, I had a Ford Foundation fellowship that brought me here. to start looking at what folks on this campus were doing by going into prisons to do arts work. And I met this man named Martin Vargas, who is a visual artist here in Michigan, and he ended up years later creating this painting, which was based on a publicity image for a play that I do about prisoners' families. And so he took the image that we had staged as part of the publicity for the show, and he put a brown beret on me, because one of the things that we connected with when I first met him in the prison was the fact that he was a Chicano and an artist, and I'm a Chicana and an artist. And so he decided that it was mind-boggling to him, having been in a Michigan prison since the early 1970s, that he would run into a Chicana in a prison, because he felt so isolated from Chicano arts and culture, except for the things that he was painting. So here's Martin. This is in the prison visiting room just a couple of months ago. He unfortunately remains incarcerated. He's been locked up for more than 42 years. And yet, he has engaged in some extraordinary arts work. So the first time I met him, I was there with this big group of people from the Prison Creative Arts Project to collect art for the art exhibit that Maria referenced when she introduced me. The Prison Creative Arts Project annually hosts the largest exhibition of prisoner art in the world. I will say that again, right here on this campus, every single year, we're in our 19th year now, we display more than 400 works of art by incarcerated artists. And Martin is one of them. Here is another piece of his art. He has become well known for drawing these creatures called pudgies, who are these really overly chubby, naked figures. And so he became a well-established artist by making these pudgies do all sorts of funny things. And in this one, the pudgy art is imitating life, and that's a self-portrait of him that the pudgy is painting. But so when I was looking at Martin's work, I was noticing, not in this piece in particular, but the art he had to offer us as we went into the prisons to collect art that day. We go in and meet with artists who have displayed all the work that they've done in the entire year, and we select up to 3 pieces from each artist to bring back to campus and mat and hang in the Duderstadt Gallery for exhibition here as part of the work we do at PCAP. So I'm looking at his art, and we're trying to decide which of his pieces to take each year. We always take 3 of his pieces because he's amazing. And I started talking to him about how much I love Chicano art, that I've been collecting it for years. And he says to me, "So what's a Chicana doing in this prison in Michigan?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to find you. I'm here to find people who are doing really exciting arts work." And he says, "Well, you know, you're not the first." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, there are these theater people, these Chicano theater people. They came back in the 70s. They were here a long time before you." And he starts describing the work of El Teatro Campesino. So this man who was locked up during some of the height of the Chicano movement actually got to see in a Michigan prison a performance of the traveling company of El Teatro Campesino, the farm workers theater started by Luis Valdez, here in a Michigan prison. And he described in perfect detail the plot of Las Dos Caras del Patroncito, which you have pictures of it in the prison?
No, my next thing.
Oh, in your slides, you're looking to see pictures of Las Dos Caras del Patroncito. How lucky are you? So it's this wonderful presentation that Anita might explain a little more about, where farm workers are actually putting on this little skit that they called actos, where they change the power dynamics between the boss and the laborer by having them switch roles. And in the Teatro Campesino, the boss always wears a pig mask, and they would take that off and put it on when he was playing the laborer so that he could become the boss, and the power dynamics were switched. So they're very funny, very sharp political moments of theater that are meant to cause people to question the power structures in which we live, and to think about how we could behave differently, how we could change our lives in relation to those structures. So Martin was doing Chicano arts work long before I met him. This is a piece called Guardians de la Patria Bajo el Quinto, and he's mixing some different time periods here. He's playing with the image of the Adelita, the women who rode with Pancho Villa when the woman is wearing the gun belts across her chest. And she's carrying the flag of the Virgen de Guadalupe, which is what the UFW, the United Farm Workers, always marched behind as part of their protests. And you see some image from Aztec sculpture as well. So he's drawing in many different time periods of Chicano history into the same image here. But after he and I met, he said, you know, I didn't know Chicanas existed anymore. I thought the Chicano movement ended in the mid-70s, and that, that was the last I was going to hear about Chicanismo, because for those of you who are not familiar with the history of the Chicano movement, to call yourself Chicano or Chicana as opposed to Mexican American is actually to espouse a political belief in the politics of the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement. So the Chicano movement held a lot of the same values as the civil rights movement that was led by Martin Luther King, principles of nonviolence and seeking equality in all different sectors of our lives in government. But it also added in things that were specific to Chicanos, like access to Chicano studies programs in higher education and bilingual education at all levels, as well as issues over water and land rights as they were taken away from Chicanos in the Southwest post-Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So after he met me, Martin said that he wanted to do a series of modern Chicanas. What do Chicanas look like today? So he did that painting that I showed you at the very beginning of me, and then a friend of his named Nina Castro is a scientist who works in I think she's in the lab at Los Alamos in New Mexico, but he was very impressed that a Chicana would have a PhD in the sciences and doing this kind of work. So not all of us are wearing brown berets and protesting, but she does have a little, it looks like a soda can with the UFW logo on it there in the background. And I don't know if you can read it, but this little Post-it note that's on her workstation is a reminder to call Papi. That's what it says. This is another piece from that series, La Sonrisa Traviesa, and he drew many more images than this than I had time to show you today, because I wanted to introduce you to a couple of other people who are doing Latino arts work in the prisons. And in fact, not all of them are Latinos, but are interested. Some are interested in Latino culture, but not just Latinos in terms of their own personal cultural history. So then the next guy that I met in a Michigan prison who was doing Latino-based arts work was in a theater workshop run by the Prison Creative Arts Project. So in addition to doing this fabulous art show, which you all could see in the Duderstadt Gallery this year from March 25th to April 9th, please come, no admission is required. And all of this is on the Prison Creative Arts Project website if you want to see the whole roster of events that we do each year. But one of the sort of bread and butter activity of PCAP is to send students like yourselves in pairs into prisons on a weekly basis to lead arts workshops. So we work in theater, creative writing, music, dance, visual art. And I was following a theater workshop, and I met a man named Johnny Williams. Johnny is an African-American man who was raised in Detroit, monolingual English speaker, and when he got to prison, he looked around him and realized that there were a good handful of men who didn't speak any English, who were speaking Spanish to one another, and who were being taken advantage of by the other prisoners and the guards, because since they didn't speak English adequately, they could easily be cheated out of things in the prison. And he decided that he wanted to learn to speak Spanish. And now, by the time I met him, Johnny spoke Spanish like he had just walked out of the Bronx. I mean, perfect Puerto Rican street Spanish. Beautiful, beautiful. So when I walked into this theater workshop, there he was doing a bilingual monologue about what it was like to be a person in prison who didn't speak such good English. And he not only had adopted the perfect Bronx accent in Spanish, but he could do the Bronx Puerto Rican accent en inglés también. So it was this beautiful moment of bilingualism and an honoring of Latino culture in a space where we don't often get to see anybody's culture honored. And just to wrap up before I take too much of your time, I wanted to show you some more images from other Latino artists in the PCAP art show. So this is an artist named Don de la Rosa, and his art sort of moves between what look like tattoos and what looks like graffiti art. He does an interesting combination of those elements, and as you can see, he draws in a lot of different imagery that historically signifies Chicanismo. So there's the lowrider culture, there's the Catholic crucifixion. I'm not sure why that lovely woman on the other side is being crucified. And he does some images of payasos too, of like Chicano clowns. And that's the Mexican eagle from the middle of the Mexican flag there in the center. This is another sort of honoring the lowrider and motorcycle culture piece called Ride Hard and Die Free. And as you can imagine, the notion of what it means to die free, or what freedom is, as opposed to the civil death that one suffers in prison, as well as the prospect of actual death during incarceration, is a big theme for a lot of the prison artists that we work with. And here's the last piece I'm going to show you of De La Rosas. It's called The Lord Giveth and the Lord Taketh Away. And in this image, as in a lot of other works by the Chicano artists I've met in Michigan prisons, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which the combination of the traditional Catholic imagery as well as the kind of hypersexualized feminine imagery of the more traditional prison art, which has a lot of female nudes. And here you also see elements of the calaveras that Mexicans use in Day of the Dead ceremonies and imagery mixed in with the traditional Catholicism. So he's pulling together a lot of different artistic traditions, which is remarkable given the fact that people in prison have so little access to images to work from. So if you were a Chicano artist on the street in LA, then you've got a lot of graffiti surrounding you, there are a lot of museums you can go to, you can walk into many different Catholic churches, you can go to the places where the people with the lowriders are hanging out in the park. You can see imagery that you would draw on in a lot of different ways, but many of these men have been incarcerated for decades and are doing a lot of this either from memory or from things that family members are sending in letters. So for them to have this many references that they're drawing into a single piece of art is really a remarkable achievement. Kind of like what Jonathan was talking about, blending different styles of music. This is the last artist that I wanted to introduce you to today is a man named Clemente Peña, another Chicano artist who's serving time in a prison in Jackson, Michigan. And his work is a little softer than De La Rosa's, but the imagery also very faith-based and very powerful. So this piece is actually called Faith and shows a kind of figure there in the background, which could be a reference to Christ. It could also be a reference to the absent father with children who are no longer able to be in his physical presence because of his incarceration. This piece is a little hard to look at. It kind of tears me up, but it's called Redemption and uses a rather traditional image of the Virgen de Guadalupe engaged with some really non-traditional imagery, even in prison art. So he's standing on a cultural reference to Chicanismo, some Aztec imagery there at the bottom. There's a switchblade next to him on a bandana, which are also symbols of Chicano gang culture. And of course, there is his face embedded in the bars as well. That's actually a pretty good likeness of what he looks like in real life. So all of these are verging on self-portraits. And this is the last piece that I wanted to show you today, because despite the fact that it's also very sad and called Broken Heart, I just think that it's a really gorgeous way of thinking about what heartbreak really feels like, to be wrapped up in the coldness and the water, and to be in touch with the elements again is also a thing we see a lot in prison art, because prisoners are so cut off from the natural world. I've actually met men and women who have spent decades without being able to walk on grass. In prison, it's also against the rules to take your shoes off. So even the idea that your feet would touch earth or that your feet would touch water, even when you're in the shower, you're in shower shoes. So there's never a moment where you're allowed to be in contact with the natural world when you're in prison. And that kind of imagery is prevalent in a lot of the prison artwork that we see, but it's also something that's very moving when given the appropriate context. So I'll wrap up by saying that I think the arts give us access to different parts of ourselves and different parts of the world than what we can actually see and touch. One of the things that is most beautiful to me about the work that prison artists are doing all around the world, not just here in Michigan, is that people in prison have to work so much harder than those of us in the outside world, both to represent their lives and to access imagery from the world outside. So if you stop thinking at the space of the walls that confine you, you've already given up. And all of the art that's coming out of our prisons shows that people have not given up, and that Latino culture is alive and well in the state of Michigan, even inside its prisons. Thank you so much.
I'm Anita, and I'm going to talk about social transformation in Latino theater. I'm so pleased we have at least a half an hour of theater. So I'm a theater director and writer, and I want to talk about how theater can serve as a way of transforming society. I think that we often think of theater as entertainment, but I view it as a way of transforming society and bringing new images to the stage. As an Afro-Latina, I'm particularly interested in which the way Black Latinidad is represented, and my plays and writings are about those experiences. I want to put before you the idea that one way that theater can change society is by creating alternative images. The media, with its representations, affect how you see yourself, and also of how you see your potential for the world. I think we're saturated with images of Latina sex objects, Latino gangsters, impoverished and ignorant Latino workers, yet this is not the community that I know. I think we can show a different side of ourselves to the theater. We can write and present stories that represent our histories and our work and market those stories to as wide an audience as possible. Putting on plays lets people express who they are without having to hide behind a facade. I also view theater as cultural exchange. There's a magic that happens when live performers come into the room. They bring their baggage and their culture with them, and collectively they strive to create something that will communicate to the audience and express ideas that are meaningful. So my work as a directing and writing artist is to try to make that synergy happen. The process contributes to the community because each person involved gains self-esteem and learns more about their own histories. So in my devising and directing work, I'd like to acknowledge the diversity of the Latino experience as well. So I'd like to include many different kinds of performers in my plays. Black, Caribbean, Mexican, South American, working together in the same room to explore our own variety. I view productions and plays as conversations, and the conversations happen between the actor and the audience, also between the performers and the director, and finally between the performers and performers as they try to create the new works. So I want to show you some videos of my work, and all of those pieces are about transformations that happen within communities. Everyone who's working on these projects, I would say, were transformed in some ways. So first is a picture of me, 40 years. I wanted to let you know I've been doing this 40 years. But the original inspiration was traveling with my father, who's the man right next to me on the right, in Mexico. And my work in Mexico, and I went on a cultural exchange program, which I hope you will, I know you'll all do, right? And in those programs, we went to Mexico and I found people, and I remember saying, Daddy, how come they all look like me? Like, what is this about? What is the history of Mexico that brings around this phenomenon? And way back then, I took a picture of this. And ever since then, I've been interested in this idea of dialogic identities, how people perform one another. These are Afro-Mexicans in real life, and these are the ways the Afro-Indigenos perform Mexicans in some coastal villages on the west coast of Mexico. And it's not a slur of them, it's just the way they see their neighbors, right? But it's also influenced by media images of how they would think blacks should be represented. So I love to watch the way that people work out these conversations through performance. That's my motto, conversations through performance. So here's another example of appearances of blacks in Mexico in street festivals that seem out of context. But yet, I mean, I could talk forever, but I won't now, about blacks in Mexico reading the book. Yes, that's the next thing. So one of the ways that I write the books is that I first do the plays. I have a thing where I have to see it on stage before I can think about what it would be like in a book. And so I explored Afro-Mexico through this idea of Yanga, who was the first black renegade community in Mexico in 1521, way early. And I hired a Senegalese performer who then to play the role of Yanga. But talk about transformation. This guy, once he learned more about Mexico, he went to the west coast of Mexico to find out more about it. And I went down there like a year ago, and he was teaching Senegalese dance. Yes! Okay. I also worked with Serafino Ponte. He's a choreographer from Mexico City, contemporary dance. Now, I don't think we would call him black here, but he calls himself black, which is what matters. And so he came through an NEA grant to become a part of this project where he played the community of workers who followed Yanga. And of course, the book came out, which is Afro-Mexico. Like, it takes a while, like 10 years before it comes out. My other area of interest is Afro-Cubano. My grandfather was Pedro Paulo González, was Afro-Cuban, and he was one of the tobacco workers in Tampa, Florida, who rolled in the communities and listened to the lectors. So I wrote a play about him in Bellagio, and I'm now working on revising it into a musical called Ybor City, which is about unionization among the cigar workers during the times where they're going to threaten to burn down the factory. And I'm working with a composer from New York named Dan Furman, who's worked a lot in Peru on developing that. So Afro-Cubans, so this is like one of the calendars of the Afro-Cuban community to show you the kind of social life that happened within those communities. I wanted to spend today, that's why we need the audio. I was looking up Dolores Prida, who was my collaborator on this piece, and I realized she's dead. I know that sounds terrible. The woman passed away. And she was a great Cuban-American comic playwright, right? A lesbian performer from New York. I went through, I was like, she sent me her resume and she's no longer with us, which is a terrible thing. And I realized that our piece, Ola Ola, has not really been published and that I thought I'd show you some excerpts with it. It was a play about immigrant women in New York, all of who were mothers who had babies they had to drop off on this babysitter. It was based on a real life story of wondering where to put my kid when I was growing up. And so, in this community house where they all come to drop off their babies, there's a conflux of Black American, Dominican, Garifuna, Puerto Rican, and Mexican women who are all stuck in New York because we're just trying to make a living. And I thought I would share an excerpt from this piece if it plays. Look at all this good. Well, let's play this. Hope you can hear it.
Job. I'm just going to show piece on the side.
Everybody talk in different languages.
Good job hunting, honey.
Job today.
These lyrics are by Hattie Gossip.
For 6 months, these people from the island walk in here one day and they're working. That's because we're willing to do any kind of work. Oh, and then that's when my people get shafted. Loyalty, minimum wage, insurance. Listen, we just came here to move, all right? Because they have some people in America that don't want to do the jobs that we do. We even do windows. We just came here to work. We always have. This wave of immigration is going to drown us all. But you better learn to swim.
Take up, 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 take up.
Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Send them back where they come from. They're taking jobs away from Americans. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Running around, making babies and getting married. Can't even talk English right.
Can't even talk English right.
They sure can count their money though.
Damn singing foreigner.
Damn singing foreigners.
Damn singing coming on books and planes. Damn singing coming over night and day.
Anytime they found a husband, they don't pay no taxes.
Damn singing foreigner. Damn singing
Got no rights and they got no pride. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners. Damn singing foreigners.
So I use dance to with it. And they go off on the subway. Okay, so that's one of Prida's pieces. I mean, I have another clip, but I think I'll pass it because I want to keep going. I want to start to talk a little bit about my work with student projects. This is Dos Caras del Patroncito with students, I think at Florida State. Another work I make with students, this is O Pagador de Promesas. What I liked about this is I worked with someone from Texas to translate the work into, it's a Portuguese play, a Brazilian play, about a man who takes a cross and he's trying to go into the church with his cross just to give honor, obeisance to the gods. And he ends up, because of the political circumstances, this is a capoeirista on the street who kind of tricks him, and he ends up finally going into the church with his wife dead. Right? New ideas I'm working on is a piece about the Caribbean and what it means to be able to take goods out of the Caribbean. I'm working on this with Nadine George from San Diego. It's about this idea of sugar being something that's resold back in the Caribbean as alcohol and as something that involves slave labor. And it involves also this guy, David Doncourt. He's singing like Yellow Bird or one of the Caribbean tunes. So people come off the cruise ship and they see this altered Caribbean island where the entire sand is made up of sugar, basically. It's an installation. And there's kind of a ghosting of the past memory of what sugar was in the Caribbean. We created it's a little more abstract than that. So I just want to say that I'm here in Michigan we have a new minor in global theater and ethnic studies. I want to continue to work with communities and students to change representations and transform people through theater. I want people to know about the rich body of work that exists in Latino theater. In this new minor, I think that students will be able to learn more about the various cultures and their theatrical traditions so that they can interact with a broader world. You'll be able to create works from your own experiences that can contribute to these changing representations. And you can learn about how to work with communities of artists and respond to other communities of artists working through cross-cultural dialogues. Today I'm very excited. I have a first group of students going to Liverpool with me, and we're going to be working with the Black community in Liverpool, gathering their stories and then recreating pieces there. And so that's the work I'm here to do. Thank you.
I'm not a performer, so, and I apologize. I'm probably going to look at my notes and the script a bit more often than the other speakers who were incredibly entertaining. I really enjoyed listening to everybody, and I wanted to thank Maria and Anna and Larry and the Latino Studies program for having this event. My name is Nilo Couret, and I am, as Maria said, a new faculty in film in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literature. And when I thought about what I wanted to talk about in regards to Latino arts and culture, I was very much thinking a bit more historically. I was thinking a bit about, what Anita was just started off by talking about. Well, we're surrounded by certain kinds of images of Latinos, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the very first images of Latinos on film. And I wanted to start by showing this clip from In Old Arizona. It's one of the first sound films. It's from 1929. It stars Walter Baxter. And it's well known in the film studies community for being the first film that was able to record sound on location, like outdoors. And it stars Walter Baxter as this Latino figure, Chan Noriega, who is perhaps the scholar on Latino film, talks about this film and talks about Walter Baxter's performance as kind of being the first, or as setting the tone for what will become the Mexican-American stereotype in cinema. And so I want to look at this film, and I want to think here a little bit more about the stereotype, what it means, and how stereotypes come to be. That is, in a sense, what my project in looking at early sound cinema in the States and looking at early early representations of Latinos on screen is about. I'm going to start with this. I don't know how.
Just click it.
Just click
it. Is that a? Yeah.
Black, how are you?
Oh, I can help you.
Okay, now hang on. See,
You can just open it with something.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do.
Open with.
Yeah. No, I'm a Mac person, so mine is also really temperamental.
Well, the VLC is good.
Yeah.
By golly, you get lots of love letters all the time, huh?
No, please don't make it no fun.
Yeah. I wish I had people. I got nobody.
Where did you come from, Tonetito?
Well, I tell you, my mother, she is born in Portugal, and my father, she has come from San Luis Obispo. My father, he's a terrible smart man. But my mother, beautiful like a rose. I run away from Portugal when I was 15. I never see them no more. Now, well, I'm sorry.
You are very mysterious.
Mysterious. Life is full of mysterious. Yesterday and tomorrow. The rainbow then, and the moonbeam peaking. Who knows?
All the time, your life is in danger.
My life. What is my life after all? The warm breath of a few summers, and the cold chill of a few winters, and then I think I need a drink, huh?
I go for nothing.
See your baby? I don't bring him first. I bring it to you right away.
Gracias, señor.
How much will it take for it?
I'm gonna stop it there. I don't want it to get worse. I mean, this is, I should point out that In Old Arizona is based on an O. Henry, the Caballeros Way. There's a lot of literature about the play and their adaptation. Walter Baxter takes on, he won an Oscar for this, by the way, back in the day. And he performed the Cisco Kid a couple more times. In the original, he's actually Anglo-born, but then spends a lot of time in the borderlands. In the movie version, he is Portuguese, Mexican, American, we don't really know. But anyways, one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit is when we talk about stereotype, and particularly when stereotypes are spoken about in film studies, we normally talk about the image. We really privilege the image, and to a degree we privilege the authenticity or the inauthenticity of the image. So we would talk about this, and this is, very justifiably spoken about in a pretty negative light in terms of the way that it functions as stereotype, or as furthering or as starting stereotype. And what my project, in looking particularly at these early sound films, is about actually thinking a little bit more about sound and how sound functions in stereotype. More specifically, when sound kind of gets mentioned in relation to stereotype, it's usually about identifying the kind of sound. Oh, well, the kinds of music, or it's percussive, or it's guttural, animal guttural sounds in some instances. And what I actually want to look at a little bit more is map the formation of the stereotype onto the evolution of the soundtrack as such. Okay, and to do that, I'm going to use some ways of thinking about sound that are borrowed from what I call sound studies and film studies. When talking about sound, there's this whole field in film studies that just thinking about sound and sound studies. Most of these people, when they just listen to these movies very carefully, some people say, well, there really isn't a soundtrack as such. You can only really talk about the sound in relation to the image. And then there's a whole other set of people that try to examine the relationships between sound elements. And there's this whole body of work that's starting in relationship to early sound film. It's looking at how these different soundtrack elements, and when I talk about the components of the soundtrack, I'm talking about dialogue, I'm talking about sound effects, and I'm talking about music, okay? Those soundtrack components are on different channels. They're recorded separately nowadays, and then they are edited in relation to one another. During the early sound period, those kinds of conventions and the technologies that allowed for that kind of editing and mixing didn't exist. So what will end up happening in early sound examples is you'll have this all or nothing logic. So you'll either hear music, or you'll hear sound effects, or you'll hear dialogue, but it's very hard to kind of hear them in relation to one another. And slowly but surely, as the technology kind of catches up, as these conventions become convention, and standardized practices, that's when you'll start getting these relationships between soundtrack components later on. So by the time this project kind of, let's say, ends with King Kong, right? So by the time you get to something like King Kong, native speech is a sound effect. Native speech is drowned out by music in a way that you won't get it in earlier sound films. So one of the things that I want to talk about in relationship to In Old Arizona, and that I'm talking about and looking very closely at some of these early representations of Latinos on screen, is the fact that in this film, as you notice very briefly, they actually speak in Spanish, and you can hear it, and you can hear it very clearly, and it actually comes up many times throughout the film, where you'll be able to hear Spanish on the soundtrack. And to a degree, it's actually a function of the fact that they can't edit them out. They can't mix them away. And in a sense, the necessity of this all or nothing logic, as well as not having as well as basically the sound is always recorded live. There's no way of recording it later and then putting it onto the film, means that everything you hear is there, and there's no way of privileging or removing voices from the soundtrack. Slowly but surely, that will change. Other aspects of this project, and I won't go too much into it because I know we're about to run over. I look at somebody like at the Latino stars and the transition to sound, and as you can imagine, their accents meant that they lost popularity. Many of them, their careers were over. They had to return, in some instances, to like Dolores del Rio, returned back to Latin America, returned back to Mexico, and looks at how their accents function set differently. In other words, one of the things that I try to look at in looking at these early representations of Latinos on screen is thinking about how the development of the soundtrack, the standardization of these kinds of practices. So, for example, if I have dialogue that I want people to hear, I'm going to lower the music. That's a kind of a convention and a standard, right? The evolution of these standardized practices. Ultimately, what doesn't get talked about in sound studies is how that evolution is ultimately along the fault lines of ethnicity and privileges this construction of what I call oral European whiteness. So whereas somebody like Garbo, there's all these ads about Garbo talks in the early sound cinema, and she speaks with a very thick European accent, but she talks. Whereas Del Rio gestures, and looking a little bit at how Del Rio is used in early sound cinema is another site of this project. And then eventually tracing and looking at the ways that these sound practices always seem to slowly but surely edit out, mix out, include these Latino voices. So that's what my current ongoing project on looking at and examining the origins of sorts of stereotype on screen is about. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, and so I'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll try not to dominate the questions. I have lots. Anyone? Come on, don't be shy. Sylvia.
I had a question for you about Latin jazz. Some years ago, we had Celia Cruz came to Michigan, actually twice, and at one point she had a breakfast with us. Us at that time was like, so many people in one hand who were faculty, who were Latinos in the Latino Studies program. But at that time, we sort of got into this perennial question, I think, for people who like salsa and Latin jazz and so on, as to where the origins are.
Of the music?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and she said that the origins were the guaracha and the son, those two very old Cuban rhythms. And if you look at the guaracha and the son, I think they are also, in fact, fusions of other rhythms. In particular, I would say that it's the music of the Canarian peasant, the peasant that came from Islas Canarias to Cuba, playing guitar with African rhythms. But if it was already a fusion, that it wasn't just Africa,
Right.
It was,
Right.
and then it comes to the United States and it becomes fused with Latin jazz.
Yeah, so, try to go back and decode your question. So just for me, when I'm drawing the dividing line between what is Latin jazz and what is salsa, they have It's the same music in a way. When I'm explaining this to my students, they often get sort of intertwined. There's a famous quote by Tito Puente that says, you know, salsa is what I eat, I play Cuban music. And for me, if I'm sort of trying to differentiate, you know, a lot of the component parts are the same. Salsa is generally music for dancing. There's a singer, you know, sonero. There's Latin jazz, some more music for listening. But the bigger difference in those two is salsa music follows more of a popular song format. So if you listen to a salsa tune, there's a verse, there's a chorus, there's a verse, there's a chorus, and then there's kind of an instrumental interlude, whereas Latin jazz follows more of a jazz form, whereas instrumentalists will play the melody, then you'll have improvised solos around the band, so the form of that is different. Going back to the point about the fusion is really true, right? So, you know, there were folkloric musics that existed in the Caribbean and Cuba and in Puerto Rico and Haiti long before Europeans arrived there, you know? So going back a step from son, there was the danzón, and then there was the contradance, you know, as European, you know, art music mixed with what was the folkloric music of those islands. So you're exactly correct in that fusion was happening even before we recognized it as Latin jazz.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, I guess I'm just wondering, you were talking about how films have sort of started editing out, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was like me, right?
Films have started like sort of editing out these Latino voices. I guess I'm just wondering, is there a possible future in which that gets edited back in? Or do you feel like it's sort of a never-ending cycle?
I mean, I think that looking at changes, sound practices have changed. I think you're absolutely right in wondering whether that narrative of they'll get edited out, if there are other possibilities. I think that there are communities and that are just dedicated to kind of recovering these lost voices and finding them. And especially, let's say in radio, for example, there was a lot, the way that Chicano radio in South California and Hollywood affected sound practices in this period is an aspect of this project as well, where, in other words, Latino voices affected these sound practices and these conventions in very concrete and tangible ways. In terms of, let's say, contemporary, can we reintroduce Latino voices? I think it's I don't have a good answer for that. I think I think ultimately one of the things that my work always tries to ask is, okay, we can talk about, okay, well that's really stereotypical, or that's a really inauthentic representation of something. But I always want to try to ask, well then how is it that we arrive at this way of representing something? And I think asking that how is really helpful, as opposed to just always kind of debating whether it's good or bad representation. And looking at these origins of the transition to sound, for me anyways, in the context of this project, is a really helpful way to then talk about classical Hollywood, which is, let's say, mid-30s through the mid-50s, and not and think a little bit more carefully about classical Hollywood, and not just kind of block it off as this, well, that was those days when people thought really horribly about, you know, ethnic others. Does that sort of answer your question? I mean, there's no real answer, but I think that being attentive to these sound practices and how this happened is a first step in then working out, well, how are we going to change the ways that we represent Latinos on screen?
I have a question about the Mexican Spitfire.
Oh yeah.
Because, what's her name?
Lupe Vélez.
Lupe Vélez, right. So I teach a women's studies class, and we talk a little bit 1 week about gendered stereotypes. And so I often show Lupe Vélez clips, which are, you know, she's kind of in the moment that Dolores del Rio, who was playing really high-class ladies
Yes.
in the silent era, has to go back to Mexico because of her accent. Lupe Vélez emerges in this as a star, really. And I play clips of the Mexican Spitfire movies against Sofia Vergara, the Modern Family clips. And there's this one clip on YouTube that's pretty hilarious, but really offensive too, I guess, where it's just all of the times that she like ends up speaking Spanish when she gets really excited. And this is an old
Sophia or
Sophia, because
yes.
Luca Velez did the same
Yeah,
thing.
exactly.
Like this was her shtick. Like when she would get really mad in in these old movies, she would just let out this like stream of Spanish, like she was talking in tongues, right? And I guess I'm curious. It's not really a question, but I'm curious
What do I think
about
Luca Velez?
when you're saying like the ways in which that kind of rapid fire Spanish goes
yeah.
away. It actually stays for a little
That's
bit.
right, but it's all. I completely agree with you. It does stay, and part of this is also looking at it always stays in women's bodies. Like that's pretty much, and the way women get represented and the way women get heard. So women are always to be looked at, right? They're always to be seen, and they're kind of never to be heard, and much less understood. And that is very much a part of this because it always gets located on women's bodies. There's actually some recent scholarship that looked very carefully at the evolution of, let's say, when we hear music that is not that is a score. That is what we call non-diegetic, so it's not coming from the fictional world, there's no source of sound from the actual screen. And it happens, and it's very funny, this is a really great piece, and it just says, well, whenever there are women on screen, you'll start getting score music. And that's kind of where the article ends, but it begs all these questions about it. So I absolutely think that you're right that the standardization of these practices almost has to account for, okay, well, there is this thing that we cannot really deal with, will locate it on women's bodies, and that's from Vélez to Charo to Vergara, you can definitely trace that.
Yeah.
All the way to Sophia.
Sorry,
All the way
up
to
to Sophia and beyond.
So speaking of locating kind of Latina identity, and more specifically Chicana identity, my question's for Dr. Lucas. I was wondering if you visit women's prisons or if you're in touch with incarcerated Latino women who are artists, and if that narrative is distinct from some of the Chicano or Latino art that we have seen.
Absolutely. I have not yet met a Latina in the only women's prison we have here in Michigan. But that doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that I haven't spent enough time. Excuse me. We have much lower participation in the arts work at PCAP overall from women than from men, because in the state of Michigan, women are incarcerated about 1 to 40 at the rate that men are, and that's fairly standard across the nation. That said, women are the largest growing, or girls under the age of 18 are the largest growing population in prisons across the nation. So there are plenty of Latinas in prison, and their artistic forms are distinct from those of Chicanos. We have a lot less access to them in terms of publications and exhibitions because women's art is not as highly publicized as men's. But there's a wonderful, I think she may be dead now, but there was a great poet named Judy Lucero who was incarcerated in, I think, both Texas and California, who wrote some really extraordinary poetry. And the men's poetry that came out of prisons during the Chicano movement really rallied a lot of the political work that was being done on the outside. So Raúl Salinas and Ricardo Sanchez and a number of other of the great poets of the Chicano movement were locked up while they were writing their poetry. And we didn't see so many women in the Chicano movement in positions that were highly publicized. So people like Dolores Huerta and others were struggling valiantly, but we hear their stories get told later, largely because of the efforts of people like Maria Gotera, who do the very important work of recovery, of bringing those voices out. So they were always there, they were always doing the work, and they were always doing what Angela Davis refers to as the housework of the movement, the things that people don't pay attention to that are absolutely necessary to get things done. And that's really true in terms of artistic production as well. A lot of the ways in which we got all of this men's artwork, both out of the prisons and into publication, is because of the women on the outside who were visiting and bringing it out and doing things with them. I'm not sure I can say enough very specifically about the aesthetics of Chicana prison art as different from what we have from men, because I haven't seen enough of it, honestly.
Well, one last question. unless someone else has one. No? Okay. So for Anita, in the last 15 years or so, there has been, maybe two decades, there has, and I know you know this, there's been kind of a rise across Latin America and in Mexico of the sort of Afrodescendiente or Afro-Latinidad movement. It was Afrodescendiente, so thinking about the African diaspora in the New World, very broadly, and acknowledging those African roots in so many places like Peru, Venezuela, and all over the Latin American world. So I'm curious about your, sort of how you position yourself in that trans-hemispheric or transnational.
So I think a lot of those movements are indeed spurred from outsiders coming in and doing research.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I think there's kind of a consciousness that may not exist within Afro-Latino culture about heritage and culture, because a Mexican person will just say they're from Mexico, you know, for the most part. That's like a generalization. But I think, so we've had all these kind of panels at different universities about Afro-Mexico, and the idea of taking our Afro-Peru or Afro-Latinidad and what's to be gained from those experiences. But I think in all of that, because they're, like in Afro-Mexico, it's the Trinidadian priest who's done a lot of work on the west coast of Mexico to bring it out. In Jarocho, I started early, and then some other people came in and kind of reinforced this idea of recognizing an African identity in a place where people may not necessarily think of themselves that way. But as people have become more aware of the political power of recognizing an Afro-descendant identity, I think that's where I've seen people embrace the movement. Because in many of the mestizo countries, we'll call them, there are organization structures, community organizations, money coming from the government to support specific indigenous communities. And that as long as the Afro-descendants aren't recognized as a specific community, then those, the money is going to go to all of the different indigenous communities. And I think it's behind that effort that really it's about money and resources and who gets the water well, say. But that's where Afro-descendants have been fighting to create a presence for themselves. And some of the panels, there's actually working for the Mexican government, there's an African ethnographer, and he is just trying to fight to have Afro-descendants recognized as a recognized community. Because as with the census and all other kinds of divisions of people that are enforced by the states, right, they're designed to reallocate resources, either negatively or positively. But in the case of Latin America, without that recognition of the Afro-descendant communities, they're unable to access resources.
And it gets muddy, like with the Garifuna, right?
Yeah, the Garifuna was the next thing I was going to say,
Yeah.
because they're one of the few that do have kind of a special, they can be referred to as the Gary Naboo, right? They have their own separate recognition.
Yeah.
Unlike other communities.
It's so fascinating, and it really recalibrates our understanding of Latinidad completely, because, you know, as I tell my students in Latino studies, it's like, you know, what was it, like 2 million African people were brought to the continent during the height of the slave trade. 200,000 were brought to the United States of America. So I mean, when we think about what constitutes Latino identity, I think that we have to really change how we're thinking about mestizaje, because mestizaje tends to have this discourse of mixture that's really only European and indigenous, but it needs to contain that third term, because even in Mexico, like I think in the 1680 census, people of African descent outnumbered people of Spanish descent by 6-1 or something like that.
Mexico, what's really interesting about doing representations of Africanness in Mexico is that there's so many different kinds, depending where you go, because in some places they're the horsemen, and in some places they're the slaves, and in some places they're the curanderos, and it really depends on what community you've been and the very specific local history of that community's contacts with African people.
Yeah, it's great work. Well, thank you, everyone. Sorry.